It's my pleasure to introduce Tamara Soma, who's a candidate for faculty position in REM, as I think everyone is aware. And Tamara has recently completed her PhD from the University of Toronto. She also has a master's degree in planning from the University of Toronto in geography and planning. She's currently a postdoc fellow in the Department of Geography and has been doing a lot of research on food systems and is working in collaboration with various entities and foundations on food. And we're very fortunate today to have her come, and she's going to tell us about planning from table dump urbanization as a driver of household food consumption and food waste generation in Indonesia. So Tamara, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, I'm just going to make sure, can everyone hear my voice? Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone. And I would like to first and foremost acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And I thank you so much for the warm welcome and for the opportunity to share my research. So usually, before I start my presentation or my research, I'd like to share a story. So how many of you have actually been to an academic conference? Okay, great, I'm in a perfect room. So I was in this academic conference, and you know how it feels like, sessions after panels, after sessions. And basically, come lunchtime, I was starving, I was very hungry. So I went straight to the food place, and I probably loaded up a little bit on the carb department. So after I finished, I was staggering and almost dozing off, sitting in my chair. But then I just remembered that my colleague went up to the front of the podium. And this colleague of mine is Aaron Mills. So Aaron Mills is Anishinaabe. He is from the Bear Clan and from Couchiching First Nations. He's an Indigenous legal scholar. So he stood up in the podium, and I was in front of him, and he opened his arms, and he said, "Greetings to all my relations. Greetings to all my relations." And those words just completely shook my core. And the reason why is because all my relations, those three seemingly simple words, are actually quite revolutionary, especially for planners, because at the core of what I believe as a planner is that it's really based on building relationships. What's really interesting also about the principles of all my relations is that it connects to inclusivity, it connects to the topic of unity, it connects to interconnectedness. All of the things that are actually built within the planning code of ethics. So when I think of what a good planning should be, I think about all my relations, because it's about relationship building not just between you and I as human to human, but also building relationship between other non-humans, so plant relations, animal relations, and especially for planners in the context of land use, all my relations is a principle that moves us forward towards decolonization and reconciliation. So I believe that's why it's very, very important. So on the agenda today, I have about 60 minutes. Somebody can wave to me if I'm going a little bit above the time. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am as a person, my biography, my relevant professional and academic experience, as well as my teaching philosophy. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about my research in Indonesia. That's where I'm originally from. And I'll talk about future research opportunities and give some time for question and answer. Perfect? Sounds good. Okay. So how many of you have heard about a food system planner? Okay, perfect. Well, you guys are in BC, and this is kind of like the genesis of where food systems planners started to kind of like work professionally. So a food system planner is basically a planner that integrates food systems consideration into their his or her planning policy and decision-making process. And this is actually one of my areas of expertise. The reason why this area of expertise is so important is because in the year 2000, two planners, so Kami Patakuchi and Jeremy Kaufman, wrote this article called "The Stranger in the Planning Field." Sorry, the food system, a stranger in the planning field. And basically in that article, they outlined how planners actually have a lot of impact and have a role to play in food system consideration and developing food secure cities. However, this area has been neglected, and that's because food is generally considered as within the domain of market transaction. So throughout my professional and academic career, I have worked for various public, academic, and civil society organizations. So I work with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. I work in the Greenbelt section. I work with a city councilor where I helped him conduct stakeholder engagement process and consultation, as well as support the community if they wanted to, for example, develop a community garden. So I've done a lot of different work professionally within this field. And also from an academic and community engagement side, I know community engagement is a very strong component of what Simon Fraser believes in and support. So I am actually the co-founder and director of research at the Food Systems Lab. So that's a really lovely picture of one of the workshops that we conducted. And the Food Systems Lab is basically a social innovation lab that tackles the issue of food waste in the Greater Toronto area. And what's really interesting about the Food Systems Lab is it really started in a coffee shop. And my colleague and I, so my colleague Belinda Lee, who's actually based in BC and is a solid waste engineer, we talked about how a lot of policy recommendations around food waste is based on this idea that, okay, on one side you have a lot of food waste, right? Corporate retail food waste. On the other side, you have a lot of hungry people, so food insecure people. Well, all you have to do is put them together, that food waste and the hungry people, and then you have a win-win solution. And we felt that this was the wrong way to go. And so we felt that, to tackle a really complex problem, we really need to bring people together, and we use the social innovation approach. And by the way, at Simon Fraser University, there's the Radius Lab, if you've ever heard about it. And so they do a lot of social innovation work too in the areas of health. So this is kind of like our way to contribute to the food angle. And the Food Systems Lab was founded to actually respond also to the calls of the TRC. And it is founded upon the principles of reconciliation. I think that this is especially relevant considering that in the context of Toronto, we are under the treaty of the dish with one spoon. So the idea of justice and food sharing is very important. One bowl, one spoon for all of us. Another thing that's really important is that the Indigenous advisors and community members that take a part in our lab talks about how their teachings and their traditions talk about food as medicine. However, food can also be used to inflict trauma. And this is the case with a residential school. This is the case with colonization. And so we believe that our contribution is to raise and leverage the voices of Indigenous advisors and experts. So for example, we work with Melanie Goodchild, and she is one of our Indigenous special advisor. She's currently working with NASA to combine geospatial data with Indigenous traditional knowledge. One of our advisors is also Marie Wilson, who is the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. So reconciliation is at the heart and core of what we do at the Food Systems Lab. Another thing that I'm very passionate about is making sure that any research or any grant that I apply and do will bring back, will have community impact. So we have leveraged various funding and various grants. So the first is the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation grant. It was a modest grant of $25,000, but it helped us start the lab. And then from that lab and that one-year process, we developed second iteration, and that won a grant for $149,000 from the Seeding Food Innovation Grant. And I am a co-applicant with Dr. Virginia McLaren, who is the principal investigator. And then after that, while we're working on the Seeding Food Innovation Grant, we also got another grant recently, just about a few weeks ago, from the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And in this particular role, I am leading a tri-country team with Canada, the United States, and Mexico to develop resources and toolkits that will engage youth in all the three countries in food loss and food waste prevention. So I think one of the great things about my experience is that for planners and for especially students that are graduating from the program, they will need to get used to writing CFP, call for proposals. They will need to learn how to manage projects from start to finish. And because I have a lot of that experience, I can really help train students and get them off to the right start. And then finally, another important component of the lab work is to mentor and supervise undergraduate and graduate students. So in our lab, we actually have research fellows from different universities. So we work with students from Carleton, from York, from University of Guelph. Maybe there will be several from Simon Fraser, I'm hoping, please feel free to apply. And one of the things that we do is to make sure that they get a lot of employment experience, they get the opportunity to apply research experience. But another thing that we do at the lab is to also present in schools across Canada. So I've presented in Manitoba, I've presented in schools across Toronto. And the idea is that we should, as an academic, we can inspire high school students at a very early stage to think about what they want to do if they do decide to go to university. So that's important. And finally, just a few pictures of some really wonderful collaborators. Patrick Najiwan, who is from the Chippewa Nawash First Nations, and Gabrielle Aladua, who is a migrant farm worker. They're important collaborators. And through the lab, what we do is we offer opportunities to engage community and match them with funding so they can do a community-based activity or a research project that they would like to do, as well as producing reports that would be helpful, not just for the community, but also for the public sector. So here's something interesting. I'm wondering if you've seen this food recovery hierarchy framework, this upside-down triangle, and it was actually published by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so one of the findings from this lab actually challenges this orthodoxy of food recovery hierarchy framework. So in this particular diagram, you will see that the first preferred way to address food waste is source reduction, but then the second one is feed hungry people. It's exactly the same thing that I was mentioning to you about. But then it just kind of goes down, and landfill is still part of the solution. What we did in the lab, because we're collaborating with so many different people, again, Indigenous elders, directors of multinational supermarkets, farmers, chefs, retailers, educators, you name it, what we've developed is we've developed and identified values that will actually feed in to a closed-loop food system. And one of them that is very special to us especially is the values around reconciliation. And that's not just because we work in Toronto, but also with some of our members that were participating in the lab. They come from countries like St. Lucia, myself, Indonesia, that were also colonized. And so this idea of justice at the global stage through reconciliation and through challenging the legacy of colonization is very, very important. And now moving on to the teaching philosophy. This is a very colorful slide, and I love colors, as you can see. So the first thing about my teaching philosophy is inclusivity. So in terms of inclusivity, I ensure that I bring forward diverse scholars, so scholars from the Global South, scholars, racialized scholars, as well as Indigenous scholars. And one important thing in the classroom is that I create a safe space where we are able to talk and have dialogue and debate. And one of the reasons why it's so important to create that safe space to disagree is because in resource management and in planning, you will always disagree. You're not always going to agree with things. And so having that skill to navigate conflict and tension is very, very important. Another thing that I really, really enjoy in my class is experiential learning. So if you think about it, in Toronto, I take students to a bustling market. I take students to a greenhouse. I take students to a community garden. And the great thing about that is that a classroom doesn't have to just be in a lecture hall. A classroom can be outside where you're observing people, where you understanding the patterns that's going on around you. So that's something that I do in my class. Another thing that's important is that I do a lot of collaborative learning in partnership with community practitioners and experts. So I might be an expert in my field, but there's a lot of other experts. And I would like to usually include them and co-teach a class together or do workshops together. So one of the events that we're doing together with the community is an urban agriculture symposium that integrates settler, Indigenous, and racialized communities in Toronto to look at how land use and urban agriculture, to look at the barriers and the opportunities around urban agriculture between the three different groups. So that's kind of an example of a workshop that we work on together. Another thing is obviously investing in students. So if you see this picture over here, it's actually the cover of Food Matters magazine. So Food Matters magazine was the final research project for my students. They basically started it from finish, from the ground up, and it launched in 2017. So in terms of their class, even though this class is of first-year undergraduate students, immediately they have an opportunity to actually publish and get published. And I work hard with them to make sure that they do and get a publication track record early on, and also integrate them with my lab. In terms of the role of a planner, I also believe that it's important to be very accessible. So one of the things that I do outside of the academic publication is to write a lot of different accessible content that summarizes and synthesizes my research. So within the body, you'll find that I'm citing my work, but I'm making it very accessible in a 700-word or 500-word kind of blog or article. And I think what I'd like to point out in this Huffington Post article, for example, that was published in the US, just within a few days alone, there were 940 shares. And I think that's very important for planners, especially because the public needs to know what's going on, the kind of policy recommendations that's being discussed. And this is kind of where I do that for the public. And another thing that I like to do with students is to help them if they want to get their research across to the media. So here's just a picture of me talking at CTV Morning. And this is where I talked about the lab and the research in my lab. And this was an interview. I was invited to speak on the agenda. And again, the media can be your friend and can be a friend for university students who have a really interesting initiative, or who may have an interesting technology, or may have something that should go viral. And so this is where I can help them, train them, and get them to write op-eds, for example, or contact the media. And of course, I maintain the balance with between public and popular mainstream media publication and media engagement, as well as academic publication. So currently, I've been commissioned to be a co-editor for Routledge on an upcoming book called the Routledge Handbook on Food Waste. So it is a big volume. It's supposed to be published next year, so wish me luck. And I also publish in various local and environmental planning journals. So now we get to my research, which is very, very exciting. How many of you have heard of the perfect storm? Okay, perfect. And obviously, we're not talking about the George Clooney movie, right? The one with Mark Wahlberg, because if you're thinking that, I know what you're talking about, but so this is kind of a different scenario. So imagine this scenario, okay? Imagine a scenario of increasing global food scarcity and increasing water scarcity. And imagine a scenario of increasing global energy scarcity, all of which will lead towards mass conflict and tension, which will lead towards global and mass migration, and which will lead eventually to a global war. So I'm just gonna pause here. And I wish this was a science fiction scenario, but unfortunately, this is not the case. In fact, the perfect storm scenario is a term coined by Sir John Beddington, who was the former UK chief scientific advisor. And so according to Sir John Beddington, he said that by 2030, we need to produce 50% more food, we will need 50% more energy, and we will need 30% more water by 2050. And if we don't do that, if we're not following his prescription, basically, we will be hit by the perfect storm. So it sounds scary, right? But there's something interesting because there's this neoliberal paradox around this. First of all, what's really interesting is that we're actually currently growing more than enough food. So we're growing we're growing food enough to feed 10 to 12 billion people. And this is according to the United Nations Environmental Program, as well as various scholars. And so considering that we're only sitting at 7 billion right now, we are beyond overproduction. And so what's interesting is then for us to ask, do we actually need to produce more? Considering that between 30 to 50% of food that's produced for human consumption is actually wasted to the tune of $1 trillion annually, despite the fact that almost 1 billion people are food insecure. So it's very interesting. And so according to studies by Kumu et al., a 50% reduction in global food waste will ensure enough food to feed an extra 1 billion people. And so for the Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, that's exactly the case. And Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 is to halve per capita food waste by 2050. And so that's the goal. And I myself am a part of this organization called Champions 12.3 that's working towards SDG 12.3. And I'm wondering if you've ever been to Lake Geneva, because a lot of you are natural resource water folks. You've been to Lake Geneva? No? Okay. Because I thought you're, okay. So, and you're probably wondering why I've put Lake Geneva 3 times. Well, that's because we're wasting 3 Lake Genevas worth of food. 3 Lake Genevas worth of water in growing food that never even gets to our mouth. So food and food wasting is a very important natural resource issue. And so when we're talking about food waste, you've probably heard of the term food loss and food waste, right? So food loss is basically anything that's happening at the farm, so post-harvest. And then food waste is waste that's happening at usually the consumer or retail side. And the argument is that food loss is a global south problem. So, and this is because, of lack of mechanization, because the farmers are less educated, and because there's less or lack of, modern storage technology. And also, in the literature, the argument is that this is so consumer waste or food waste is not necessarily an issue in the global south because people are, quote unquote, too poor to waste. However, I find this very problematic, and especially when we have, aggregate data such as this. And that's because if you're looking at urban centers across the global south, especially megacities like Manila, think of Jakarta and Bangkok, the urban consumption is very, very different. And so I've been talking about food waste all this time, but maybe we haven't really delved into what is food waste. And the answer is that it's quite complex, actually. It really depends on your culture. It depends even on your spirituality. It depends on your class and where you're coming from, etc. So does anyone know that picture up there that is looking a bit bulbous? Does anyone know that? So that's actually a corn that's been attacked by a fungus. It's called corn smut, okay? And so the story is that in the United States, a farmer went out and then saw that all of this cornfield was attacked by this particular fungus. And he was frightened, he was devastated. But then he talked to someone, and it turns out that corn smut, or huichahuatle, is actually a delicacy in Mexico. So in Mexico, farmers would be up in arms celebrating in joy if they can actually get their corn to be this way. So again, it's quite complex. How many of you actually eat broccoli stalks? Okay, great. So for some people, I do a lot of waste audits. I do waste audits for conferences. I do waste audits for research, of course. I don't audit my own waste. But for broccoli, it can be potentially avoidable food waste, right? Because for some, it is waste, and for some, it's not. How many of you eat meat? Okay. How many of you would actually eat chicken intestine? Satay. Okay, a lot of adventurous folks here at REM. So in my culture, when you eat an animal, you eat pretty much everything. So the organs and everything inside is a delicacy. But of course in Canada or the United States, that's not as common. So you usually have everything divided into the chicken breasts and the chicken thighs and the chicken wings, but not everything in between. Now finally, do you know the Muffin Man? So the Muffin Man, I'm not even joking, is actually a legal case. So in Belgium, there was a homeless man by the name of Steven de Geyns. And so he's homeless, and he saw a bag of muffin that was discarded in a grocery store dump, okay? He took it, and he was prosecuted for theft. He actually had to go to court because of one bag of muffin. And the argument, although he was acquitted and he was not eventually jailed, is that even if a supermarket throws their waste, it doesn't mean that they have given their right to it. So that was a very interesting waste studies kind of case. Now, this picture is quite sad. This is not Indonesia, this is India, I believe. And so what's really interesting about food waste is that when it's decomposing, it generates the greenhouse gas methane. And methane is more potent than carbon dioxide, about 20 to 25 times more potent. And so in the global south, especially in Indonesia, literally, food waste in landfill is a ticking time bomb. So in Indonesia in 2005, 143 people were killed because a methane explosion triggered a landfill slide, and that killed 143 people, which includes children, and children are also waste collector. So the reason why I put this quote, and the quote says, "Waste is the political other of capitalist value, repeated with difference as part of capital's spatial histories of surplus accumulation." So even in this research, when I'm talking about waste, within our broader society, there are also people that are considered as waste within this system. And as Mary Douglas said, they are matters out of place. And so now I'm getting into my research. I want you to think about these 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. So try to absorb them. And so these 4 questions that I'd like you to absorb while I go through my research is: 1, who gets to define and categorize what is food and what is waste? Who has the power to frame the problem? Who gets to develop the solution? And who bears the burden of managing and absorbing food waste? And so what we know from the literature is that households are the largest generator of food waste. However, there's a lack of consumer food waste research, as I mentioned, in the Global South because of various assumptions. There's also a gap in the literature comparing between incomes. So how do different incomes waste and consume? And also a lack of understanding about the impact of different types of retail on food consumption. In addition, there's also a lack of consideration for social and environmental justice issues in the field of food waste studies. And so this is where my research is contributing. And so I use 3 different theories and conceptual framework. The first is practice theory, the second is food waste regime, and the third is distancing. And I'm going to focus on practice theory and distancing. And then finally, just to add a further context, because I like to be thorough, is this New Urban Agenda. So the New Urban Agenda is actually part of a stream in the Canadian Institute of Planner, and this is where a lot of my research fit in. But in our process of kind of developing and growing world-class futures, what we want to understand is that world-class cities also produce world-class waste. And so considering that 66% of the urban, of the world's population is going to be urban by 2050, and the majority of the growth will be in Asia and Africa, this is a very important issue. In addition, there's a growth in the middle income population, and with the middle class group, there's usually a dietary convergence towards Western type foods. So there's an increasing demand for meat, an increasing demand for dairy, an increasing demand for variety. And what happens with that, especially in the case of Indonesia, is that the growth of the middle income, the urbanization, is going to increase food waste in general. And it's projected to be an increase of 49% between 2005 to 2025. So that's a big increase. So the research question that I address in the study is, how do urban households with diverse economic backgrounds consume and waste food? And then I have 3 sub-questions. The first is, how is food waste managed at the household level? How do social, material, and cultural factors influence food consumption and food wasting practices? And how can findings from this study be used by planners to develop strategies to reduce the generation of household food waste in Indonesia? And so how many of you have been to Indonesia? Hooray, okay, so where were you at?
Jakarta, Bali.
Okay,
Lombok.
perfect. And how about you, Sean, right? Yes, Jakarta, okay. So this is a map of Indonesia, and then the island of Java, and then this is Bogor. So Indonesia is an archipelago of 17,000 islands with thousands of ethnic tribes and thousands of cultures and languages. So I come from the island of Java in the West Java. So I'm a Sundanese ethnic tribe. And Bogor is 60 kilometers south of Jakarta. So when you were in Jakarta, if you just drove south 60 kilometers, you would have reached Bogor. And the city of Bogor is rapidly urbanizing. There's over 1 million people, and the core of the city is one of the most densest places in the world. So if you like a lot of people, come to Bogor. You will never be alone. And so this is where I did my case study. So the methods that I use is mixed methods. The first part is a qualitative method, and with this I use ethnographic approaches, so participant observation, the going along method, which is really fun because I got to go shopping with people. probably the best part of my research. And then also I did multiple in-depth semi-structured interviews with 21 households, 7 upper income, 7 middle income, 7 lower income, and 12 key informant interviews with planners, with waste managers, with informal waste collectors, directors of supermarkets, you name it. And then with the quantitative method, I administered household questionnaires to 323 households, and 154 of the households are low income, 107 are middle income, and 62 are upper income. And then I analyzed the data in SPSS and just using basic statistics, chi-square tests and ANOVA. And so moving to the theory now, how many of you have actually applied practice theory in your research? Okay, probably not. Okay, so it's actually quite easy. According to Shav and Pansar, to really understand everyday practices, you need to think about 3 factors. And so when I'm talking about everyday practices, it can be as simple as showering or throwing your garbage. In this case, I'm looking at food provisioning practices. So the 3 factors are material, meaning competence, MMC. So for the material, that's talking about the built environment, infrastructure, technology, refrigerators. For the meaning, we're talking about diet preferences, values and tastes. What do you think is the idea of good food? Do you like freshness, or what is your cultural values around food? So that's all meaning. And then competence is the last. So competence has to do with literacy. It could be, do you know how to cook? It could be, do you know how to store your food? And it could also be like, do you know how to compost or how to separate your waste? So material, meaning competence. So I'm now gonna move to the material part, which is the most exciting, especially because I'm a planner. So in Indonesia, there are very diverse food retail. And just to make it simple, it can be categorized into modern and traditional. So on the modern side, you'll have the hypermarkets, right? So the hypermarkets are like the Walmarts. They sell food, but they also sell clothing and pharmacy and every single thing in a big box. There's also the supermarket model, which is focused more on food, and then the modern convenience store. So your typical 7-Eleven. So we have that too in Indonesia called Indomart. And in the traditional side, there is tukang sayur. So tukang sayur is the mobile vegetable vendor. And so they come every day to your neighborhood, 7 days a week, mostly in the morning to just before lunch. And what they do is they sell just enough food for you to eat the day. And you don't need to stock up because they're coming every day. So you don't have to worry that they're not going to come. And then another traditional vendor is called the warung. So warung is on the top. And literally, it's a small neighborhood convenience store, but unlike the modern convenience store, they usually don't have a lot of refrigeration. So it's literally that table is what you have, and then the next day they'll bring new seasonal food. And then the last one is the wet market. And so the wet market is 100% local, and it brings a lot of different fruit from different farmers. So that's called the wet market, and it's actually quite wet because in many cases there's no roof over it, so when it rains, there's a lot of puddles, so hence wet market. But also because there's a lot of organic produce, that's also why. So why is the built environment and why is retail important for my research? And that's because there's been a massive transformation in how people actually get their food. So in the late 1990s, then President Suharto, he was a dictator for 30 years. So he actually opened Indonesia to foreign direct investment and market liberalization. So what happened in the 1990s was that there was an influx of multinational corporations, especially supermarkets. And so by 2005, after that big influx, 30% of food that is purchased in Indonesia are actually from supermarkets. And as supermarkets profit growth at 15% per year, traditional retailers are seeing their income decline by 2% per year. And so as Joko is one of my respondents, but his name is different. I've changed it. So he said, before, the only supermarket we had was Gelail. So those who went there, were rich people. But that's not the case. They are everywhere. And when you shop at supermarkets, the products you get are cleaner, and the price differences is actually quite small compared to traditional markets. So as you see, the trend is moving towards people accepting supermarket more as their kind of main place to get food. And here's just a table, and it's very simple. But what I like to show you is that there's a difference in where households shop based on their income. So in the low income column, what you'll see is that the low income respondents, 26% of them, so only 26% actually go to supermarkets. But on the other hand, 90% of them will shop at the warung, the little picture that has like one table. On the other hand, if you look at the high income respondent, 93% of high income respondents shop at supermarkets. And then only 38% would actually go to the warung. And so Saskia, who is a high income respondent, stated, for me, I don't go to wet markets because they're harder to access. I work, so I can't go in between office hours to the wet market. Basically, Giant, so Giant is that hypermarket, Total, or other hypermarkets cater their businesses for people with long work hours like me. And why do they have long work hours? Because they commute. So it's part of the whole urbanization process. And supermarkets are more convenient for a lot of people who commute and work long hours. Another thing that's connected to the supermarket revolution and the spatial concern is around spatial exclusion to traditional mobile vendors. And there's two parts that I want you to kind of outline to you. The first has to do with price wars. So supermarket engage in this practice called price wars. And basically it's where they really reduce their prices so low, so very, very low, to the point where no one else can compete. And then once everyone is kind of like eliminated, that's when they can then have power to monopolize the prices and then raise their prices. And so Asep, who is a mobile vendor, and this is not Asep, that's Mr. Udin. And so Asep said, if we are talking about comparing my net income before and now, we're talking about a huge difference. Since Giant, a multinational hypermarket chain, arrived, my net income now is much smaller compared to the past. It's because the price difference, the prices at Giant and the prices at the Pasar is wet market, are different. I need to make some profit to feed my family. So the mobile vendors buy their food all from the Pasar, the wet market. They go there and then they buy them out and then they pack it up and then they sell it to the community. So the Pasar, as I mentioned, is all local and seasonal, and he can't compete with the supermarket. But what I think is very important is also there's this spatial exclusion. So during my study, I would go to exclusive gated neighborhoods for the upper income household, and mobile vendors are literally banned. And they're banned because not only are they seen as a blight, but a lot of those exclusive neighborhoods are actually developed in adjacent or like in collaboration with hypermarkets. And so they are also seen as competition. So I found that very interesting. Another thing from the supermarket model that has transformed Indonesian consumption pattern is this trend towards buy one, get one free. So you're probably familiar with that, right? Buy one, get one free. So that's actually a flyer from a supermarket, and it says, beli satu, gratis satu. So this did not exist before, but with the rise of the supermarket revolution, it's becoming commonplace. Another thing has to do with stringent aesthetic standards. So you've probably heard of the ugly fruits and vegetable, right? It's big in BC. I think BC is one of the leaders in Canada in terms of like consideration for food waste. So what's interesting is that in the warung and in the wet market, you don't have that stringent aesthetic standard. But in the supermarket, as one director told me, we have a grading process. For example, let's say someone comes and they want to be a supplier of shrimp, chicken, or fruit. Well, we have an SOP, standard operating procedure. For example, the shrimp has to be a certain size, the chicken has to be a certain color, the fruit has to conform to a certain grade, and there's a certain standard of ripeness, a standard size. What's interesting about this is that not only is it eliminating a lot of perfectly good fruits and vegetables that are completely edible and have high quality, but just maybe look a little bit wonky. So it's affecting the farmers, obviously, because they don't have that access to the market, but it's also impacting Indonesians' expectation of what is acceptable type of fruits and vegetable. And then here I'm bringing the distancing part and the urbanization part. So in natural resource management, some of you may be familiar with the framework of distancing. And the definition of distancing is the separation of primary resource extraction decisions from final consumption decisions. And the consequence of this distancing process is that one, resource will be overused, and there will be more overconsumption and waste. And two, is that there will be more opportunities for environmental and labor exploitation and violation, which is the case with a lot of natural resource issues in Indonesia, for example. And what I find very interesting with the supermarket, and I have that number 80%, is that a supermarket manager told me that 80% of the food that he sells is imported. And so only 20% is local. And he said that's because the seasonal food does not meet the high standards. And so how it looks like in the food context is that distancing impacts us, urbanites and Indonesians, by separating the food growing process with the consumption process. And so through that distancing, there's that kind of disconnect between our understanding of how food grows. And in the case of Indonesia, and why I'm showing this picture, is that for some classes, the consequences of that waste is literally distance, so out of sight, out of mind. For example, that's why we have, I had a colleague from the Philippines asking me, why are Canadians throwing waste in my country? And I'm like, I'm so sorry, I didn't do that, but unfortunately, we're shipping waste everywhere. But for the low-income communities, many of them actually have to live with and among waste. So while in some cases, things are distanced, for some groups, it's actually brought near. Another thing connected to distancing and urbanization is this issue with land scarcity. So you probably know the cases of land scarcity, and that's why the value is so high. Well, previously, the low-income respondents had a lot of self-sufficiency. So for example, Ayu said, before I used to grow cassava, bananas, and corn. Now the land has been used to build those big houses. Near my house, there used to be trees, rambutan trees. It's a type of fruit that it's hairy fruit. Banana trees, cassava, different types of trees. There are some folks who planted spinach, tomatoes, and other vegetables. When we needed food, we just picked it. Now it's so difficult. So what's happening with a lot of the land that low-income respondents used to go and get their food is now a big box store. And this is the type of modern retail development that is being pushed all across Bogor and all across Indonesia. And so finally, this is the final part on on distancing, is that I talk a lot about spatial distancing, but you probably understand that there's a connection with mental distancing. And mental distancing is this issue of the commodification of food. So in the supermarket, when I went on my going along trip, what I've noticed is that when people would get something, if they don't want it, they just put it wherever. Some of us may be guilty of that, but I'm not gonna ask anyone to raise up their hands. But so in this particular case, meat, beef. So meat was picked, and then they decided at the last minute that they didn't want it. And so this, instead of bringing it back to the fridge, which then will allow other people to buy it, it had to be chucked. And so this commodification of such a precious resource, such a precious relationship, is basically is disconnected in the supermarket model, where you don't really know where food is coming from, you don't know the grower, and you don't have that very strong relationship with the people that work in your supermarket. And so here, again, I just wanted to share with you the warung. So in the warung and the traditional form of retail, what I would say is that they're called buy today, eat today infrastructure. They allow for small purchases and smaller consumption, which will lead then to less wastage. So a higher percentage of lower income households, 57.8%, they still shop buy today, eat today. But that is less so with the middle and upper income household. And as you notice, do you see the banana over here? Do you see how it's all like speckled and spotty? Well, that's not gonna go. That's not gonna fly with the SOP of the supermarket. But in the warung and the wet market, this food will still have space for the market. And the last part of, I promise with the material part, is the refrigerators. So here's just a fridge comparison, and you're probably wondering why I'm calling a refrigerator an infrastructure. And what I want to remind all of us is that this is a larger part of the global cold chain infrastructure. Without the global cold chain in our food supply, our global food system would not be possible. Everything has to go through a global chain, and this is a component of it in our household. In the upper and middle income household, the refrigerators are huge. They are double door, like what we have in Canada, and sometimes they have multiple refrigerators, 2 or even 3, and there's one that even has 4. And so in the refrigerator, you'll see that it's jam-packed, and they have similar issues such as overstocking and forgetting food at the back of the fridge. Now compare this to the low-income household, and obviously not every low-income household will have a cat that looks into the refrigerator, which is very cute. But if you can only imagine those two refrigerators, they're like about yay high, or like the dorm refrigerators, very, very small. And when I go there, it's usually empty. And so when I talked to one of the low-income respondents, she said it's usually used to only store water. Okay, so in Indonesia, we're all boiling our water, and because it's so hot, it's very important to have refrigerators so that at least you're not drinking very hot water in a hot climate. So basically, a refrigerator is for storage of water. And then we talk about material. Now you're expert on the material part, and then there's meaning. So meaning is important because it all has to do about, what do you think of food? What do you think about the value around food? So interestingly, the majority of the respondents, so 83.3%, agreed with the statement that their faith prohibits them from wasting food. What's really interesting is actually in my qualitative study, respondents actually quoted from the Quran, believe it or not. And my respondents are very diverse. There's Christians and they're Hindu, but this respondent said in the Quran, "And give thou to the kinsman his due, and to the poor and the wayfarer, and squander not thy wealth extravagantly." And the term she used is mubazir. So mubazir is a term that's used to reflect a taboo around wasting. And so whenever they think that they're going to waste food, they say, "Oh, mubazir," and then they would either give it to someone, or they would transform it into a different food, or they would give it to the animals. And then finally, there's also cultural prohibition around the wasting of food. So there's a tale of the crying rice, and I can talk about it maybe during Q&A, or if you invite me again, then I can share the whole story. So that will be fun. And then finally, around meaning. So what's really interesting about this is that there's a lot of complexity and fluidity around household. So as a planner, a lot of my work deal with households. And in Indonesia, when you have kinship, when you have a lot of intergenerational family living in the household, that's kind of complex. And a lot of the recommendations and interventions around food waste is actually based on this nuclear family model. So Athira, an upper income respondent, stated, "There are 13 people eating here, consisting of the core family of 6, myself, my kids, and the grandkids. There are 2 domestic helpers, 1 working part-time, 1 live-in. Then there are 3 drivers, 2 are full-time, 1 part-time. Then there are the construction workers, 2 people." So you can only imagine the complexity of developing policies, recommendations, and solutions for that kind of like fluid household based on kinship and various other matters. And then the last kind of part about meaning that I wanted to share with you is that 56.7% of Indonesian give surplus food or leftovers to someone else. And this again has to do with that food sharing, right? But there's something interesting about this. So in a journal article that I published in the local environment, I talked about how in the middle and upper income household, the act of sharing food is termed as gifting. So they're literally gifting new food, rare food, foods that are delicacy. But between classes, so between upper income and lower income, it's not gifting. It's ridding. And the reason why it's ridding is because they're usually giving food that are unwanted, food that are leftovers, food that are old from cleaning the refrigerator. So while in a sense, sharing food can be good in terms of building relationship, but in another sense, the lower income people in Indonesia time and time again become the conduit of food disposal. So finally, we're down to competence, MMC. That should be a wrap or something. But I'm not gonna bore you with the wrap, I promise. And so in the competence part, a lot of planners use this, and a lot of planners and waste managers and people that are very interested in understanding how to transform people's behavior towards environmentally sustainable practice, they use this theory called the theory of planned behavior or theory of reason action. And the idea is that ABC model, if you increase awareness and you increase the education, then behavioral change will occur. However, there's something called the value action gap. And you know all of this. Like I know that probably eating a lot of chocolate is not good for me, but I'll do it anyway. Why? Because X, Y, and Z. I'm not gonna tell you why. So there is that value action gap and we see it in Indonesia. So here's an example. 26.6% of low-income respondents, 43% of middle-income respondents, and 59.7% of high-income respondents stated that they all know how to compost. However, 92.6% of the respondents never compost their food waste at all. And why? When we dig in deeper, we realize that there's issues around spatial infrastructure. There's not a lot of land to actually compost. There's also issues that occur because of packaging. So here, Joko mentioned that before until the 1980s, you could pretty much dig and put the garbage in the hole. Yes, dig a hole and put the waste in, but what becomes problematic now is the packaging. Before, there was only a small amount of plastic and tin can waste. So in Indonesia, we used to package everything with banana leaf, right? It's so good, it's so aromatic, and it just biodegrades, and also bamboo. And because of that, when you're talking about waste management, it's literally on site. You can do it in your own home. But now, with the advent of styrofoam and plastic and tin can waste, waste collection now is no longer within the domain of household. Now you have to rely on municipal waste collection. And that makes it really complex, especially when the municipal waste collection is uneven. So they're only gathering about 68% of the waste in Bogor. The rest are not serviced. So it's only when you have money will you get waste collection, and everyone else will just have to figure a way to throw or slip or dump their waste anywhere. And so this is where that competence comes in. And so this brings me perfectly to my future research project, and this is my second to last slide, because I'm sure I'm running out of time. And so in terms of my future research project, I've actually already finished a draft of a Shirk Insight Grant proposal to explore the emergence of zero waste stores. Now, BC people will probably be very excited because you guys are probably the pioneers when it comes to zero waste stores in Canada. And what I'm really interested is in really understanding the impact of zero waste stores, who are going there, and this intersection between food packaging and food waste, because as you know, a lot of food are packaged with best before date, and that results in a lot of confusion. Honey has a best before date, and honey lasts forever. So I'm really interested in that kind of dynamic. Another thing that I'm doing, obviously, is through the Seeding Food Innovation Project. I am currently working on understanding the efficacy of food waste awareness campaigns to 3 different models: community engagement, social media, and gamification. So my lab currently is developing a food waste game that households can play to see if that's going to educate them a little bit further and how we can address the reduction part. And so for research and supervision, I can supervise students in urban sustainability, circular economy, food system, waste management, especially retail, infrastructure, stakeholder engagement, which I'm very passionate about, the social innovation model, and sustainable development in the global south, particularly in Asia and Indonesia. So to conclude, I believe that it's very important for planners to understand the intersection between the 3 factors that I mentioned: the material, the meaning, and the competence, in order to understand the complex everyday practices. I also feel that it's very important to invest in spaces, land, and infrastructure that can actually integrate food production and food waste management. So it's an integrated system that is closed loop, and this needs to be developed. And the third conclusion is that investing in small, medium-scale traditional food retails and hub is very important. So right now, Indonesians still have a choice. We still have a choice to go to the mobile vendors. We still have a choice to go to the wet market. But with that price war and with that spatial exclusion, that choice will probably be gone. And here, most of us shop from supermarkets, and there are less choices, except for some of us that might have a little bit more money to go to a farmer's market. But not everybody have the money to do that. So investing in that alternative market is important. And then finally, integrating food consideration in planning documents and policies. So while we've grown and while we've integrated a lot more of food system consideration in planning cities and even in reports, this still has a long way to go, and this is where I can bring in some of my expertise. And so thank you very much. Terima kasih, which is Bahasa Indonesia. Hatur nuhun, which is Sundanese. And that's my email if you want to get in touch. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry, I'm just going to grab a drink.
We'll open it up, have a little drink, and we'll open it up to questions. You can probably manage your own questions if you like.
Absolutely, I will do that.
Okay.
Okay, so who wants to be the first? Yes, Sean. Perfect.
Thanks very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Great slides and really interesting material.
Thank you.
Could you draw a connection to perhaps some of the work that you've done in Toronto around food waste and agricultural systems?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I actually work, so after I did my Master's of Science in Planning, I myself was a food system planner for the organization Sustain Ontario. So with Sustain Ontario, I work a lot on the sustainable food production side. So I work with urban, rural, and peri-urban farmers, especially in the areas of alternative land use services. So that's ecological system, like it's an award basically for farmers who conduct good ecological practices. So I was working on building that alliance and building that opportunity for the farm side. I still do a lot of work with urban farmers, especially in the areas of improving access to community-based composting, because in Toronto, that's still a big issue. This idea of community-based composting, there's barriers around it because the idea of moving organic waste from one side to another side is still considered as kind of moving toxic waste, although that's not really the case. But so the reason why I got into the food waste side was because I was actually working a lot on the production side. And that's when I realized that all of the work that the farmers are doing in terms of, developing more ecological practices, in terms of supporting the local economy, that's not gonna make much sense when people are just wasting all of that effort. And so what I realized is that I also need to look at the consumption side and then connect the loop. And that's where, that circular economy and closed loop food system is now part of my approach to food systems planning, in that it's not just a linear supply chain, it's actually a circular system. Thanks, Sean. Yes?
Give a reminder to pass this around so we can record the questions. Do you want to repeat the questions?
Yeah. So Karen, right?
Yes, Karen,
Yes.
thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. It was
Thank you.
really very interesting. You've moved from Indonesia to Canada, and I find it fascinating to see the cultural influence on the way foods are used. Canada is a country with a lot of different cultures that are intermixed. Do you have a sense of how much of that cultural connection to food and the way food is used in Indonesia is kept when coming to different urban communities in Canada, and how much is lost?
That's a very, very good question. So actually, during my work also with Sustain Ontario, I work with diverse farmers who so they come from diverse cultures. So some from Jamaica, some from, Ghana. And what they said is that, we believe in supporting a local economy, but we still want our food, right? And so how are you gonna bring that okra? How are you gonna bring that, the very long Chinese beans, So So there are ways where farmers and not just farmers, but community members have been able to bring their support for local food with the cultural side of making sure that they can still have their diet. But I would say that in terms of literacy, a lot of it is lost. And I know for myself, I came to Canada when I was 17 years old, and I wasn't really taught to cook food, and what little I knew, a lot of the food was not available in Canada. So another interesting thing is also that retail, right? So the influence of retail and time scarcity. So I live in the most urban core, Bay and Bloor, and busy. And what happens is that sometimes I gravitate towards the food that is easiest to make, which is spaghetti and meatballs. And so I can try to make it a little bit Indonesia with a lot of spices, but still, that's probably going to be the easiest. So I do think that there is that loss of competency, especially from the intergenerational side, where I'm kind of disconnected to my grandmas and my aunties, and they have a lot of that knowledge in terms of food competency. Yeah. And sorry if I talk a little bit fast, by the way, because I get so excited about this issue that so just, Tamara, come down. Feel free.
Hi,
Hi,
Cliff
Cliff.
again. You mentioned neoliberalism a little bit, and obviously you're looking at the changes from this very small vendors to the supermarkets and hypermarkets. So this is kind of an open question, but I'm interested in your take on the influence of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, on changing food systems.
Yeah. So with capitalism, especially in growing and urbanizing cities like Indonesia, one of the interesting thing is just this idea of abundance, right? So this idea of abundance with the food system is not something that, this idea of abundance and this idea that we always deserve this diversity of food. So in terms of capitalism is that the supermarket, for example, when they talk about the 80% imported food, the manager said that this is to cater to my middle and upper income consumers. And that's where that all fits in, is that a lot of the type of food, the imported strawberries and the imported apples, when Indonesia actually has local strawberries, although it's seasonal, right? So you have to eat it during the season, and you can't expect to have it throughout the whole year. And that's changing the system, and that's because a large component of the population have that capital to demand certain types of food and certain types of variety. So that's very important. Another component of capital is the type of urban development that we're seeing in Indonesia, especially with big box development. So for example, the idea that wet markets are dirty, the idea that instead of revitalizing it or instead of reshaping it in a different way, that supermarkets are more kind of like the gold standard, that's also based on a capitalist model that is also a Western type of urban development model. And so the big box store, I think, is just expanding in Bogor. And I see prime agricultural rice paddies and farmland being paved over, from the places where I used to grow up, and now it's just kind of big box store. Yeah, just a little bit, but maybe we can chat more. Another question? Yes, Murray, right? Is that right? Okay.
Very good.
Can you?
Okay. It's so big, right? It's very big. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You're getting all the questions from the front row. I really enjoyed your presentation. You can see why you win storytelling awards. Very well done. A lot of what we do has to do with trying to influence behavior. I think all of us do a lot of work in that area, and clearly what you're doing has a lot to do with trying to influence behavior. You mentioned a couple of theoretical models about behavior and about the roles of education, other kinds of things like that. I think we all end up acting with our own internal model of how we think we influence behavior or can influence behavior. Can you tell me about yours?
Perfect. And so I'm just going to kind of bring a study that I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Michael Carolyn. So Dr. Michael Carolyn is an agriculture expert and a sociologist, but he also uses practice theory, but from a sociology standpoint. And what he did was he did a study where the issue was about labor rights of migrant farm workers. And so the first thing he did was he exposed people to a video and then just told them to shop at the regular supermarket, and then exposed them to a video, and then they went to an alternative market, and then exposed them to a video, like a documentary, and then actually brought them to the farm to work, just like a migrant farm worker would work. And one of the things about practice theory is, again, it's about the way that the built environment and space impact us. And so what he found was that the people that actually went and had to do the hard labor, they were affected the most, and they were the one that then became more active in terms of migrant farm worker justice and rights. So I know in one of my study, I'm doing a research on the efficiency of awareness campaign, but that's partly why, because this awareness campaign model is going across Canada and internationally, and we don't fully understand, when we're spending multi-million dollars on awareness campaign, like how much is it really impacting people's behavior? And so I think infrastructure is key. For example, I live in an apartment, and it's very hard to compost because you have to bring your dirty compost, down. And so a lot of people that I see, they just throw it in the garbage chute, and that's because the garbage chute is on our floor. You just put it in, nobody's gonna watch you, but the compost, you have to be stuck in an elevator, and the elevator, by the way, is always off service. So then you're there with plastic bags of dirty, stinking compost, and people just don't want to deal with that. And so I believe as a planner that we need to invest in that spatial and infrastructure side, and that's why that practice theory is very useful for me. But also I find that in a lot of different kind of ways to motivate behaviors, a lot of it is kind of addressed on individualized solution. And the problem is that there's a system behind all of this, and that systematic solutions are not often considered. And this is why we need to talk about the hard questions of what is the system that we're engaging in, and how is it then funneling to influence different kind of practices. And so, for example, sorry, I'm a little bit going on, but you know how Saskia talks about time scarcity? So interestingly, if you want people to waste less food, the solution might be to say, well, we need a 4-day work week, or we need a work week that's only like 9 to 4, and so people are less in a rush, or we need to create more job opportunities where people live. And that's another planning solution, right? So that people can actually manage to do all of the other environmentally sustainable practice. So again, it's not about always blaming the consumer and blaming the individual. It's also trying to look at how everything else is influencing their everyday practices. Long winding. From the back. I'm just kidding. Yes. Sean. Perfect. Okay.
You wanted to see if you knew his name.
Of course. Sean Cox.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Director.
I love that echo, the echo after director.
Anyway, I forgot my question now.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I'm just curious, a lot of what you're talking about is about plant food waste and things like that, but what about protein? Are there particular issues around that?
Protein waste. So just going back to the cultural side, and in that journal article that I published in Local Environment, I talk a little bit more about cultural values around meat consumption, and especially the consumption of offals. You know, offals are the organ. And so what's really interesting is that this one respondent was living in the United States at that point, and he was working as a busboy. And then the owner of the restaurant was going to throw away all of the gizzards and everything, and he said, "Oh, don't throw it away. You know, I have a cat at home. I'm going to give it to my cat." Well, it wasn't for his cat. It was for him, right? And that's because culturally he knows that it's good. From an Indonesian perspective, he knows that, you know, he wants to eat it and it will save him money. But in the context of the United States, he was very embarrassed about eating all of the animal, right? Because it's seen as like very gross. And so what's interesting is that in the lower income household, when you're eating organs and things like that, they're like, oh yeah, you know, I eat it every day. And that's because they actually don't have access to the chicken breast. They don't have access to the chicken drums. You know, what they have access to are the chicken claws and the innards, mostly. So even within Indonesia, there's a hierarchy too about who gets what. And so when I did my participant observation in the household, I would notice that the employer would say, okay, I'm going to give this to the domestic helper, but I'm only going to give the chicken butt part. And then like the rest of the good parts are for me. So, you know, it's a very complex thing. And maybe your question is not necessarily about that, but I'm kind of answering it in that way because there's just different valuation and even different hierarchies about what part of the animal is seen as acceptable as food. Yeah. But if your question is different, I can probably elaborate.
Like in North America, we eat a lot of protein.
Yeah, yeah.
We see the meat parts, we see the good parts.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yes. Oh, okay. So here's an interesting story. So I've talked with a lot of people, even with some of the largest meat processors in Canada because of the Food Systems Lab. So they actually come to be part of our lab, and so they said that a lot of the meat parts are shipped to Asia. So when we eat the chicken breast, the Asians get all of the other bits. And what Michael Carolan showed in his study in, I believe, the Solomon Islands was that turkey butts. So we eat a lot of turkey, especially for Thanksgiving, and the turkey butts have been shipped to the Solomon Islands for a very long time, and so it's become their delicacy. However, the turkey butt is the fattest part of the meat, so health-wise, it's not good. Again, so there's like all these, that's why I put that, the question, who gets to define what is food and what is waste, who gets to define the problem, who gets to define the solution, that all matters because the power of moving things around that is unwanted, it all has to do with privilege, right? So if you have privilege to categorize things and then say, well, you get this part, you get that part, then that makes a difference. Yeah. Okay. Tom. Gunton.
Very good.
Okay.
So who does get to define? Who
Prob-
does get to define the food problems? That's a question you started out with, and you identified a lot of different stakeholders and actors in this, from supermarkets, consumers. And so who would you identify as the primary definers?
Well, from the field of food waste studies, it's mostly European-based scholars and European-based studies, and this is where I'm coming from as an Indonesian scholar from the Global South. So even in the framing of the problem, remember food loss and food waste as this idea that we don't really need to address consumer food waste in the Global South. Because why? Because the type of intervention that a lot of institutions or a lot of other major kind of development experts want to do in Indonesia is not to curb consumption, is to actually modernize and mechanize agriculture further. And that's why the interventions in Indonesia are to bring more genetic drought-resistant seeds, so GMOs, to increase mechanizations by including, GPS technology and tractors, and so again, it's about, what kind of intervention will come out of it. And so if it's an intervention that's actually trying to bring people back to less consumption, that's not an intervention that's necessarily going to be a win-win for the status quo model. And this is why the alternative infrastructure is kind of under threat, because they're actually allowing people to just buy less. And buying less in this throwaway society and planned obsolescence is not something that is promoted.
So, and just to follow up on that then is, as planners, we're always interested in, to follow up on Murray's point of how you develop and implement policies to mitigate problems that we perceive. So what policies would be at the top of your list? And how would you go about implementing them, and how would you measure the effectiveness of those?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's very interesting, I actually read Sean's and I believe Mark and Sean Connolly, Sean Markey, and Mark Roslin. So you've done a lot of work on sustainable community development and the social economy, but also there's a lot of talk about scale and this idea of growth. So one of the things that in terms of planning that I'm looking at and I'm kind of like challenging is this idea of continuous growth and economic development, but economic development for what, right? So in the case of Indonesia, a lot of the recommendations that I've put forward, especially for some of the university colleagues in Indonesia that I work with, is actually to look at what you have in Indonesia that's actually your asset. So the asset is that there are scalable infrastructure that will support sustainable practices that fits within the context of the local community. However, that is under threat. And so how can local communities and how can communities in the Global South look at their assets? And so that can be through, mapping your assets and what you have and the resources that you have. So that's part one, is to challenge this idea that we always have to scale up, and this idea that we have to continuously replicate, but replicate what, in what context? And then secondly is this idea of that closed loop food system. And I think we don't talk about that as much, and that's because this urban agenda is focused on kind of looking at this as a continuous process of all of us just urbanizing without thinking about, well, what happens to all of the spaces where we need to grow our food? What happens to the rural communities? What happens to rural development and rural infrastructure? So I think that that's kind of one of my angle too, is to look at how we can be more self-subsistent in the urban center, and how we can be very resourceful in our use of buildings and our use of little plots. Instead of growing grass, we can grow food. So a lot of different community-based solution is actually a great approach to address some of these problems.
So is that going to change you looked at the behavior of upper income and middle income as really the drivers of these transformation in the food system. Is what you just described, is that going to change their behavior?
Well, I think one of the thing about the upper and middle income is that when, remember that slide on meaning and values?
Yeah.
Is that many of them have that value still, but many of them are also faced with that dilemma of very long commutes, busyness, and time scarcity. And so the shape of, okay, so here's in Indonesia, you will be trapped in a traffic, and there's actually an article about it called Macet Total, which is kind of like deathly traffic, complete absolute traffic. Literally, you can be stuck from Bogor to Jakarta and be there for 3 hours. Right? It should be 40 minutes, but you can be there for 3 hours. Now, there's not a lot of investment in good public infrastructure, but how about if we did invest in a lot of good public infrastructure and people can go back and forth faster, right? So there's a lot of different ways that's actually not food related and more from the even transportation planning side or environmental planning side that can address the food problem, but from different angles.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. What's your name? Because I want to memorize it too. It's Katerina? Very nice to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. One of the things that I sort of took from it all was the similarities between the things that you identified that was happening in Indonesia with the way that they use food, with the way that we use food, especially with that package of meat that you see sitting in the candy bars. But the one thing that I'm wondering is, what do you think is sort of the most unique food challenge that we have in BC that's different from what you see maybe elsewhere in the world?
Unique challenge of food in BC. Well, that is a very, very good question. Usually I talk more from an Ontario context, but I think with BC, there's a lot of a very strong food system network. So there's the BC Food Systems Network, there's the Farmers Brazilian Farmers in Cities, Farmers Feed Cities network. And so I think in BC, there's actually a lot of different opportunities. I would say in terms of like the network that you have, but I guess one of the unique issue, and I think it's a unique issue, but in some way more so with bigger cities, is this land scarcity issue. And so when we're thinking of land scarcity and the lack of land and spaces to grow food, we might want to look at the cases of Singapore, or we might want to look at other places that are growing on top of roofs, that are doing a lot more in terms of urban agriculture. And so that's something that can be done in a lot of bigger cities. Toronto, by the way, just launched the Urban Agriculture Day, September 15th. So, that kind of commitment to growing food in the cities and connecting people to where their food are coming from, and also creating spaces where you can actually recycle the nutrients back to the soil through like composting. That is, I think, what is a very useful opportunity for cities such as this. Yeah.
Other questions? John, you must have a question. I've never seen you at a presentation without a question.
Did I make you speechless? Okay.
Here you go. Sure. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, eh?
Sorry.
Jeez.
Sorry. Oops, okay.
I come from, I'm Haudenosaunee. I come from Dish with One Spoon territory.
Oh, perfect.
And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts. I think culture and food go hand in hand. And just in terms of the impact that I guess culture might have on our consumption habits in BC.
Let me see. Okay. So in terms of consumption habit, of course, a lot of what I know is mostly from the Ontario context and from the Indonesian context. But I know from communicating with my BC partners is that the awareness is very, very high in BC. In fact, when we are talking about a lot of the Canadian cities and what they're doing and what our initiatives are, a lot of us are kind of using BC as the benchmark for success. So I would say that there's a positive side to that, of course. But what I would like to caution is that, contexts are so different. So I was just recently in Newfoundland, and then I was in the Yukon, and the context of growing, the context of what is food, the context of, wild meat, that differs very much, right? So I was talking to a Mohawk grower, and she was talking about how in her culture, the specialty is corn, right? To then say, for example, that, hey, you really need to focus on this, or you really need to focus on that solution, that's quite disrespectful. And instead, what I like to do is I like to immerse myself and learn more before kind of offering something for BC. So that's what I would just say. Yeah. Thanks. Hi. What's your name? Brandy. Nice to meet you.
I really did like your presentation, and I found it interesting that Indonesia's food market is so similar to, I'm from Kenya, and it operates the exact same way. We have the wet markets and the local vendors who come by every day. I was just wondering, would it be better to create better infrastructure for like the wet markets? That way you can move some of the market from the hypermarkets to the local markets?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Indonesia, the current president has a plan to revitalize the wet market. And that's again because the wet market is actually the source of income for a lot of Indonesian farmers, right? Because they're like 100% local and seasonal. And so the only problem with this current policy is that it's only focused on rural areas at the moment. And so, what I would argue is that we really need it in urban centers because the supermarkets are not going to rural areas. The supermarkets are going where the money is, which is the urban centers. So I agree with you. The only caveat I would say is that I did some research in Spain. And so I went to Barcelona, Mallorca, and Madrid. And Valencia, 4 cities. And I looked at the impact of market revitalization. So a lot of these markets like the mercados are very much municipally owned. And so in that process of revitalizing, sometimes they make it so elite that then the people that used to go there are kind of afraid to go. And then suddenly, instead of getting fresh fruits, you're getting caviar. So, there is kind of a balance that we need to consider also because, you need to move the vendors out of the space. So, how you're going to manage the vendors and make sure that they don't lose any income. So there's a way to do it that would be beneficial for the wet market without gentrifying it, I would say. Yeah. Great point from Kenya. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, Tamara, thank you again so much.
Thank you very much.